Good day. Thank you for joining and welcome to another consultation and discussion for the study on country safeguard systems of the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the safeguard policy review and update process, or the SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. My name is Azim Manji, your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 13th thematic consultation topic or theme so far, and this is the second in a series of consultations and discussions on country safeguard systems. In today's consultation, we are joined not only by Bruce Dunn, the Director of Sustainable Development and Climate Change in the ADB, but also by Zara Abbas, a Principal Environment Specialist with the Safeguards Division, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. For this second of 5 sessions on the theme of country safeguard systems, our consultation is primarily with the government stakeholders of ADB in South Asia and Central and West Asia. 74 of the 94 pre-registered participants are external stakeholders to the ADB, and 67 of you are joining from 10 countries in these 2 regions. We have an additional 7 participants from other regions who are also joining. We note that India has 48 reps representing 65% of those registered, minus the ADB participants. We also have 1 advanced question that we will seek further clarification on before going to responses. In this consultation, Ms. Zara Abbas will present the main summary issues related to the study she and her team have authored on country safeguard systems, and the relationship of the study of relevance to the safeguards policy update. From the presentations, we are hoping that participants like yourselves will share insights on the potential gaps of the provision and implementation of the 2009 policy, and propose recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming revised policy. Comments received from this consultation will inform the revision of ADB's safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. As all stakeholders and participants have already consented when joining, ADB is recording this session for the purposes of preparing a summary of the meeting. It is the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly to all members of this consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address posted in the chat box. Please then join from a quiet, distraction-free area, ensuring that your microphone is off when not speaking. And during the Q&A session, you may ask questions by typing them into the chat box or raising your hand. You may then be asked by Jelson to unmute yourself, and if you wish, to turn on your camera so you can ask your question live. As we're all colleagues, let's ensure we have a collegial atmosphere. Please ensure that you are respectful to all others joining. Jelson and I will manage time to keep within our schedule, and should you experience technical difficulties, IT support will be provided. You may ask for support by typing your issue or query into the chat box in any one of the languages we're using today. As we're all joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance notes when using the important buttons. Aside from English, we have simultaneous interpretation in Hindi, Russian, and Urdu. To access the simultaneous interpretations feature, click on the globe icon found on the lower part of your Zoom screen and select the preferred language. Press the mute original audio button so you can clearly hear the voice of your simultaneous interpreter. For those of you listening in Hindi, Russian, or Urdu, if you feel the simultaneous interpretation is too fast and that the interpreter is struggling to match the pace of the English speaker, You can ask the original speaker to slow down by going to the bottom of the Zoom screen and clicking on the reactions button. When you've clicked on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, you can then press the slow down button, which is two reverse arrows pointing to the left in white. This will let the English speakers know to slow down accordingly. We ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name in Zoom, click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Then on the right-hand side of your screen, look for your own name. Click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name, and then click on the Rename button. Then you can type in your name, the agency you represent, and then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or share feedback, click the Chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, click on the smile icon or the reactions button, and then click on the raise hand emoji. To speak and unmute yourself, click on the microphone icon, and if you wish to show yourself, click on the video icon. We value diverse and informed feedback from our wide range of stakeholders, so let me refer you to the slides on ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. I'm not going to go through every word of the slide, but you will understand the meaning because it's also presented in a number of different languages in the chat box. But just a reminder that these sessions will be recorded and documented and subsequently distributed during and for each event. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. If you wish to opt out of the recording and distribution of the recordings, please contact the Secretariat through the email address that's in the chat box. You can also contact the Secretariat should you have any concerns on the recording, confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination during the course of these consultations. For this consultation, we have about 2 hours. So here's what we have planned to maximize our time as well as your time. This agenda slide shows that first, Mr. Bruce Dunn will provide his welcome remarks. Mr. Dunn, as I mentioned, is a director of the Safeguards Division within ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Second, within the same department is Ms. Zara Abbas, who will share the main issues and findings of the nature and context of the study on country safeguard systems as related to the revision of the Safeguards Policy Statement. After the second presentation by Ms. Abbas, we will have a brief 5-minute break, and when we resume, we will have a moderated discussion as facilitated by Gelson Garcia, the Senior Social Engagement Specialist on the Stakeholder Engagement Team, also within the Safeguards Division. Gelson will serve as the Q&A moderator that will last for about 75 minutes. A reminder that you may ask your questions and share experiences either in the chat box in English, Hindi, Russian, and Urdu, or through raising your hand as previously explained in the Zoom functions. Some of you may also wish to pose your question anonymously by sending your question to Jennifer de Belen or Jude Gonzalez, whose names appear in the chat box. Please send them a private message in the chat if you don't wish to reveal your identity, and they will articulate your question to the consultation session. You may also wish to send messages after this consultation to the Safeguards email address, and a response will be emailed to you directly. This will also protect your identity. Gelson will prompt us with guide questions to frame the conversation. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Director Bruce Dunn, who will offer us a wrap-up and indicative next steps following the consultation. As such, and without any further ado, I would like to call upon Director Mr. Bruce Dunn for his welcome remarks. Mr. Dunn?
Thank you very much, Azim. And thank you, good day, and welcome to everyone joining this regional consultation today on country safeguard systems. This is being organised as part of the review of updates, the review of ADB's 2009 Safeguard Policy Statement, or SPS for short. And I'm very pleased to see many government officials from South Asia and Central and West Asia, as well as other regions joining this session today. We're always pleased actually to have many of you coming back that have joined previous sessions. As Azim mentioned, this is actually the 13th thematic consultation topic that we've held so far, and I'm pleased that actually many of you are consistently joining these sessions so that we can have a sustained discussion and dialogue, which will surely be very useful as we go into further discussions around the actual drafting of the policy. Now, as many of you have joined previous consultations, I of course don't need to provide too much background, but there are always some who are joining the consultations for the first time. So I'll just start off by giving a little bit of a background into the process for updating the policy. Firstly, to say that ADB launched the update process in August 2020, and this followed an evaluation of the effectiveness of the SPS by ADB's independent evaluation department. And that evaluation study had several main recommendations. The first and key one was that ADB should update and modernize the SPS, importantly building on the implementation experience, and also looking carefully at the policy updates of other multilateral financial institutions. Many of them, as you all know, have updated their policies more recently from the ADB, and of course, some of those work in the same regions and have had discussions with many of our developing member countries around those policies. The second key recommendation, and one that is very relevant for today's session, is on the new approach, or their recommendation that ADB should develop a new approach to strengthening and use of country safeguard systems. And of course, we'll be talking more details about that today. And then there was a series of other recommendations that suggested that ADB should strengthen its own implementation framework for safeguards, while also enhancing our guidance to our developing member countries and clients, and improving capacity and skills. And I think those areas also around guidance, capacity, and skills also relate very closely to the way that we go about working with you on country systems. So in fact, many of the aspects of the IED recommendations relate quite closely to the topic that we'll be dealing with today. Now, ADB management endorsed all of the recommendations, and then we launched the process to update the policy. The policy update will be implemented over about a 2.5-year period, and we're targeting the new policy to be considered by ADB's board by March 2023. Now, for those of you that are joining us for the first time, you can find further information on ADB's website. You'll be able to find a background paper and also the stakeholder engagement plan, plus all of the analytical studies that we have produced so far, including the one for today on country safeguard systems. Plus, we'll also be dropping the link to that documentation and the website in the chat so that it's easily accessible for everyone. Now, just turning to today's consultation topic. So we're going to be focusing on country safeguard systems. And this is actually a very important issue because one of the key objectives of the SPS was actually to help borrowers and clients to strengthen their safeguard systems and to develop capacity to manage environmental and social risks. And of course, all of you are working within sovereign nations who have their own policy frameworks, who have their own laws and regulations related to environmental impact assessment and environmental management issues, to involuntary resettlement, or to a whole range of other issues that are encompassed by our safeguard policies. And of course, that is the building block for the work that we do. We do, of course, come in with ADB's policy, and we're looking to ensure consistency in the way that we implement our safeguards across different developing member countries who may have differences in their own legal frameworks. But of course, your systems are the backbone, and your capacity to implement is also, obviously a critical strength that we need to build on and support where necessary. So that's why this was included as one of the key objectives of the policy. It's really just so important. Now, ADB has endeavoured to support strengthening of country systems over the last decade since the policy was approved. In fact, over the last 10 years, we've allocated more than $50 million in technical assistance to support the strengthening of country systems. And this has included things like direct support for policy and legal reform, also the development of tools and guidance in different sectors and different areas covered by safeguards. Plus, at both country and regional levels, we've provided support for training and other forms of capacity building. Then in addition to that, at project levels, we typically provide support for things like additional technical experts and assessments, plus project-focused capacity building. So, in addition to the $50 million that I've mentioned, often many projects will include additional technical support and sometimes technical assistance piggybacked on the actual projects themselves to support in project-specific areas that are considered to need additional help. Now, that's typically been the approach to strengthening systems, but what about the use? And on the one level, you might be able to say we use country systems all the time because we need to be able to ensure that we're actually consistent with the country's own legal frameworks when we implement. There are often gap-filling measures and support that's provided, but the country system is really the mainstay. But there is actually a provision in the safeguard policy statement that allows for the specific accrediting and use of CSS at either country, sector, or agency levels. And so far, we have only really moved forward on this, comprehensively through assessments in 3 countries. That's been India, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka. However, the experience has shown that that's been quite challenging. And in the next presentation, my colleague Nasera Abbas will present further details on those experiences. Now, wrapping this up all together, the IED evaluation, just coming back to that, looked at some of the past experiences. And they have certainly recommended that we need to find a more pragmatic, you might say a more practical approach to the strengthening and use of country safeguard systems. And this is something I think our own teams agree on. It's certainly a long-term agenda and one where we need to get the right balance and of course, work very closely with you on. So that's why this consultation is so important. We really do want to hear from you in terms of your own experiences, the lessons learned from working at project levels in the context of our existing policy. Also, how do you think we can move forward in a more practical way with either the strengthening or use of country systems? Now, to provide a bit more background into the topic, my colleague, Ms. Nasera Abbas, has a brief presentation for you, and she'll be going into some further details on some of these topics. And then, as Azim mentioned, we will then follow up with a moderated discussion to hear your views. So with that, thank you very much again for joining, and I'll hand over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And good day, everyone. I will just be sharing the format that we'll be following for this presentation. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'll first give a brief background of the study, starting with its objectives, how the existing SPS covers the strengthening and the use of country safeguard systems, and the findings of the comparative analysis that we undertook, and how the lessons of the study and the previous work that we've done, how that's been incorporated, or how that will be incorporated into the policy update process. Can I have the next slide, please? The objective of the study was to learn from our experience with ADB's current SPS in strengthening and use of country safeguard systems, and to propose next steps for further consideration based on our experiences and those of comparator MFIs, and those MFIs which also have such provisions in their safeguards frameworks, and where they also incorporate or allow for the use of country safeguard systems for their projects. Next slide, please. So here, this slide lists what the policy provisions are of the SPS with regards to country safeguard systems. So as Bruce just also highlighted, that at the very level of the policy objective, it emphasizes that that we would strengthen the client's safeguard systems and develop their capacity to manage environmental and social risks. So that's up there at the objective level. And other than that, also beyond strengthening, the SPS also has the provision of using country safeguard systems. So the country safeguard systems can be used at the level of the country. They can be approved for use at the level of the country across all types of projects, or across a sector, a specific sector, an agency, or any other provincial level where the laws may be different, for either one safeguards or for all safeguards, for any number of safeguards. It could be environment, involuntary resettlement, indigenous peoples, all three, or any combination of these. In order to do so, to be able to use CSS, the very first step is to undertake an equivalence assessment. So this equivalence assessment looks at whether the country safeguard systems are designed to meet the same objectives as the SPS, and then also, in addition to that, adhere to the policy scope, triggers, and applicable policy principles. In addition to that, the next step is that an assessment of the implementation track record of the CSS is also required. So these two steps need to be undertaken. So as in undertaking the CSS, if CSS is approved for in either country or at any level, ADB still retains the supervision or supervisory role over the projects, and the accountability mechanism also, the role remains unchanged. That is also that can also be applied. Next slide, please. So after studying our policy, our experience with in the area of strengthening, which is an objective level commitment, and then also how we've worked with using the CSS, we also reviewed the approach that other MFIs are taking in this area. And these MFIs that we looked at include the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the World Bank. So these allow for the use of borrower systems in their projects, the projects that they finance. And what we wanted to see was what were the key features of their methodology. So this comes from the IED evaluation, where it was recommended that we need a more pragmatic approach and a methodology for assessing the use of country systems. So this is why we wanted to look at it, and what are other comparators doing in this sense, in this area. So when we looked at AIIB and IDB, we saw that both undertake reviews of the client's safeguard systems. And if these are found to be either materially or functionally, one of them, that's the terminology that they use, if they're materially or functionally consistent with the objectives of their policy framework, And if the system is adequate to address the risks and impacts of the project for which it is proposed, then the use of CSS is allowed. So when this assessment of is undertaken, gaps, if gaps are found, those gaps in both cases are filled through a gap filling time-bound action plan. And that action plan then becomes part of the legal agreements for that project. So what we see with the World Bank is that the World Bank also supports the use of borrower safeguards frameworks if it addresses the risks and impacts of the project and achieves objectives materially consistent with the World Bank's environment and social standards. The World Bank has recently also supported the application of national labor laws in the place of the World Bank's ESF standard on labor and working conditions in selected cases, where they saw that relevant labor organizations reported that the national labor laws are successfully being implemented. Or in the case of project level use of CSS, the World Bank reviews the framework to assess whether it will enable the project to meet objectives that are materially consistent with the ESS, the standards. And in addition, at the request of the borrower, the World Bank may conduct an overview assessment of the borrower's safeguard systems and its implementation capacity with the objective of identifying where the borrower's frameworks need strengthening and if there are any avenues for capacity building support. So this assessment, the overview assessment, can be used to assess material consistency with the standards. Next slide, please. So as Bruce just mentioned, the IED, the Independent Evaluation Department's review of the safeguards policy. So the evaluation, which was undertaken in May 2020, completed in May 2020, has one of its recommendations is that ADB needs to adopt an approach towards the use of borrower systems with the view that it is more systematic, it's more pragmatic and systematic, and undertakes systematic improvement of the country systems. So this was, and this also should be done in a manner that it employs a sustained approach towards legislative, policy, and capacity development through a broader set of financing modalities. So it also hints a bit at this, that we should look at different modalities for implementing it. I'll go into this in a little more detail when we come to the next slides. Next slide, please. So in the area of CSS strengthening, as in the opening remarks, Bruce had explained that over the past 10 years, ADB has gained considerable experience in working with our developing member countries in implementing activities through technical assistance projects which focus on strengthening of country systems. And these efforts have been building the capacity in national safeguard systems through various avenues. As he just explained, that also it could be training, it could be guidance, the development of guidance, or the establishment of learning centers for safeguards, and which basically overall contribute to the outcome of better implementation of safeguards. So, and on this slide, there are some details that ADB initiated more than many technical assistances coming to about more than $50 million in the past 10 years. And one of the things that was done were reconnaissance level equivalence assessments, which were undertaken for 40 DMCs. So these provided a high-level overview of what the safeguards framework of these countries looked like, and that helped to identify. And if these assessments are continued, then that can be similar to the overview assessment as mentioned earlier, and can be a means of identifying gaps. Next slide, please. So here I will discuss the experience of ADB in the use of country safeguard systems, and basically assessing the use of country safeguard systems. So in 2017, ADB reviewed the corporate safeguards framework of the Power Grid Corporation of India and approved the use of agency level CSS for future ADB projects. So not only does Power Grid have its own safeguards framework, but it also has the, excuse me, has the authority to amend those systems. So the safeguards assessment, when it was undertaken, it identified gaps, and a gap filling action plan was prepared, and that included in the project's legal agreements. Following the Power Grid project experience, between the period of 2017 to 2019, 3 other DMCs, India as a whole, not through a company, national level, and Indonesia, Sri Lanka, requested ADB to assess the feasibility of using CSS. In 2017, the use of agency-level CSS for environment and involuntary resettlement was explored for Indonesia's state-owned electric company, PLN. So unlike the case of Power Grid that had its own safeguards framework, PLN, though it is a state-owned company, but it follows the national safeguards frameworks for implementing its projects. So to assess the equivalence, each SPS policy principle for environment and involuntary resettlement, along with its several components, were compared against the relevant national laws and regulations for environment and involuntary resettlement. And wherever gaps were found, gap-filling measures were identified, and these were discussed with PLN. While for acceptability, then the implementation practices were reviewed in detail. Now, this entire process took a long time for many reasons, such as availability and accessibility of detailed laws and regulations and their legal translation into English, discussions with other line agencies which are involved in implementing these safeguards at the field level, and also discussion with other MFIs that have been involved in capacity building in Indonesia. And this includes the World Bank, who together with ADB established a Safeguards Learning Center in Indonesia to build national safeguards implementation capacity. And this was done as part of the joint community of practice on safeguards, which was shown on the previous slide. A group which was developed in 2016 to build capacity in the region for safeguards implementation. So the PLN Board of Directors has the authority to issue decrees that are legally binding for PLN staff and its contractors. This feature of PLN made it possible to fill the equivalence gaps after identifying gap-filling measures. So a gap-filling action plan was agreed upon between ADB and PLN adopted a decree to implement the gap-filling action plan. However, the proposal to use CSS for PLN operations could not be submitted to the ADB Board of Directors because of delays caused by COVID-19 and also changes in the legal framework of Indonesia, and that required further analysis and further consultation on the assessments. So concurrent to the request of Power Grid of India, in 2016, the government of India also requested an overall national safeguards review for all 3 SPS safeguards, as well as sector-level summary equivalence assessments for the energy and the road transport sectors. Draft equivalence assessments for these were prepared, and they were shared with the government for feedback. And once this feedback is completed, it will be possible for ADB to finalize the assessments and discuss the next steps with the government. So at the same time, in 2017, while the PLN initiative was ongoing, the government of Sri Lanka also requested the safeguards review for agency level use of CSS by the Road Development Authority. The RDA is also a state-owned enterprise like PLN, but in contrast to Power Grid and to PLN, it does not have the authority to issue binding directives or decrees. So the assessments were undertaken, and when the gaps were identified in the environment and involuntary resettlement safeguards, due to the fact that these that RDA could not fill those gaps with legally binding directives, it was not possible to implement a legally binding action plan, as it was done for Power Grid. So, however, going forward, ADB and RDA agreed that ADB's further support should focus on acceptability for more long-term, to ensure the longer-term outcomes on safeguards, and the RDA safeguards implementation capacity could be built. So this was done by updating RDA's safeguards manuals to strengthen its safeguards implementation capacity. Next slide, please. So the experience with the current SPS assessment methodology that I just explained, when it was analyzed, identified some key challenges. So firstly was establishing equivalence, and the safeguards policy principles are comprehensive and complex. And there are a range of requirements that are embedded within each policy principle. And a single safeguards policy principle can have many, many aspects and many requirements, which when they're compared with the national legal framework, can be spread across multiple laws, their regulations, and also different regulatory bodies. So making the analysis of establishment of equivalence very complex, lengthy, and a legal exercise. Another challenge observed with establishing equivalence is that it is an ongoing process, as laws and regulations may change frequently, and each change requires for revisiting the assessment or completely or partially revisiting it, with each revision necessitating disclosure and public consultation. So it was seen also that there was difficulty in accurate translations of the DMC's legal framework to compare it with the SPS. Then filling the equivalence gaps was also found to be difficult, because in agencies that have the authority to make corporate rules, it was possible, while in other agencies where this is not, cannot be done, the gap filling action plans could not be implemented, and where the agency does not have the authority to fill those, to issue such directives. And then in the case of acceptability assessments, it was also seen that it was often difficult because reliable acceptability assessments were not possible, as sometimes the data was not accurate, and it was sometimes not available, and some limited or only available to a limited extent. And this meant that there was a need to undertake field level audits of projects, but that also is very time consuming and resource intensive. So gap filling measures and also that gap filling measures of changes in the national legal framework also have the likelihood of creating new gaps in acceptability. Next slide, please. So it was seen that agency level use of CSS was only possible where the agency has a robust system and the legal authority to change that system. So from this experience, we can draw 5 key lessons, and I'll go into those now. So the first is that there is a need to pursue early strategic engagement with DMCs. So this can be done through ADB's country programming exercise. When the regional departments are planning the country engagement with their DMCs and the country programming strategies are being developed in consultation with the countries, it would be useful to engage at that early stage and engage in policy dialogue on CSS and identify priorities for strengthening CSS. And this can then serve as a basis, as a baseline, and then can be a means to identify indicators which can be monitored in the future. And then the other one is strengthen capacity building approaches. So in addition to continuing ongoing capacity building initiatives such as the Safeguards Learning Centers that were just mentioned, there is a need to develop new approaches to build project level safeguards capacity at DMCs based on priority sectors, again, identified at the CPS stage. So now, in order to mainstream safeguards good practice into CSS, it's important that there are at times institutional and legal reforms are needed, and it's important that they're implemented. So again, to be able to do that, it's important to have long-term engagement, starting at the CPS stage where you identify the sectors and then slowly build dialogue, have dialogue and build capacity, and also identify areas where there can be further engagement. So I'll continue with these lessons on the next slide, please. Progressive strengthening of CSS by linking safeguards outcomes with financing modalities. So in the previous slide, I mentioned long-term engagement to achieve legal reforms. ADB's policy-based lending provides the opportunity to converge national systems towards good practices for safeguards through policy enhancements. And so what is meant over here is that when we start engaging at the CPS level at the country level upstream, and we identify that there are certain areas which are can be strengthened, but policy reforms are needed. So this could be an opportunity where policy-based lending, the window is explored, and so that's what this implies. Another financing modality which is currently in use and is quite similar to how we have been looking at CSS is the results-based lending modality. In this case, in the RBL case, it applies CSS at the level of a program with ADB safeguards as a compliance benchmark. Program action plans are prepared to fill the gaps between ADB SPS and the program systems. And therefore, the RBL can be a means to progressively build safeguards capacity at the level of the institution, implementing the RBL, and improving practice and introducing enhanced systems slowly over time. And then there's also the potential to explore CSS at the projects level or at the level of standards. So there's a need to explore the use of CSS at the project level, and that could be done by considering methods for achieving material or functional consistency, and those methods that are similar to the ones that are being used by the World Bank, AIIB, or IDB, with a focus on achieving outcomes to address specific project risks. At the moment, our policy goes beyond objectives and looks at the scopes and triggers at the policy principle level, making it a very long exercise and very, very complicated. Another area that could be explored is the use of CSS at the level of a particular standard. And for this also, we could look at the World Bank experience, where they've just recently explored the use of national labor laws in the place of the second standard on labor and working conditions, after relevant international organizations reported successful implementation at the national level of the local labor laws. So in each of these cases, gap filling, there will be gaps, but gap filling actions and capacity needs can be linked to the project through legal agreements. And this, as I just explained, the results-based lending modality already applies this approach, but at the level of a program. So I will stop here and I'll hand it back to Azim, and he will then take the discussion forward by sharing some questions with you for the next discussion session. Thank you. Azim?
Thank you, Zara, for the wonderful presentation and also for providing us with the clarity and, of course, the feedback and some of the comparative IFI processes related to the country safeguard system study, and in particular, the objective of how the ADB can help borrowers and clients strengthen their safeguard systems and develop the capacities necessary to manage various country-specific risks, as well as the acceptability and equivalency principles which you spoke about. I'd also like to thank Director Bruce Dunn for framing and contextualizing the discussion. We hope we can get further feedback from you, the stakeholders and participants, on what the ADB should consider in these general policy topics and areas during the facilitated Q&A session. This session, as I mentioned, will run for about 75 minutes, but there is a little bit of flexibility in that if necessary. Let's now pause for a 5-minute break. Before we do, though, can I just mention that we have a poll that will be coming up a little bit later on the Mentimeter using menti.com, and that link is posted in the chat box now. What we would like to know is how we can improve the level of engagement and interaction and discourse and consultation and feedback with you, our stakeholders. What can we do specifically to improve the way we interact, receive input, and improve the clarity and rigor of these consultations? If you would like to put 3 or 4 or 5 sentences down for the ADB to consider on how these consultations can be made even more effective and better, please feel free to do so by going to the link now or at any point up to 2 or 3 hours after this consultation. When we return from the break, we will be joined for a Q&A session that will be led by Gelson Garcia, our senior stakeholder engagement specialist on the SEP team, who will frame the discussion and set the context for the Q&A session on country safeguard systems. You will see at the top right-hand corner of your screen a countdown timer of 5 minutes. When that timer reaches 0, you'll know that it's time to return to your screens. We will also have some background music playing, and as that music fades away, you'll also know it's time to return to your screen. So with that, we'll leave you for 5 minutes and look forward to returning afresh with the Q&A session. Join us for that if you please. Thank you. Thanks very much, and welcome back, everybody. We will now have the country safeguard system study discussions as facilitated by Gelson Garcia. With Ms. Abbas's and Bruce Dunn's context in mind, let's now hand it over to Gelson, who will take the questions in this order. Firstly, advanced questions. Secondly, questions asked live through the raising of the hand function using the reaction button on the Zoom screen. And thirdly, through questions posted in the chat box. Gelson, of course, will prompt us with the guide questions that were flashed on the screen during the break to help us frame the conversation. And a reminder that you can ask questions in English, Hindi, Russian, or Urdu. And you may also post your question anonymously by sending your question to Jennifer de Belen or Jude Gonzalez, whose names appear in the chat box. Please send them a private message in the chat if you don't wish to reveal your identity. You may also send messages after this consultation to the Safeguards email address, and a response will be emailed back to you directly. This will also protect your identity. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Director Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap up and the next steps following the consultation. So let's start without any further delay. Mr. Garcia, over to you, please.
Thank you, Azim. Can you confirm if you hear me well?
Hear you loud and clear, Gelson.
Thanks. That's good. So good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon from Manila. We are now in the important part of our consultation, the moderated Q&A. This is the session when ADB is in a listening mode when it's time for your voices to get heard. We have approximately 75 minutes for listening and circling back to comments. While you are still formulating your questions and comments, I have 3 important points to guide our discussion. First, this second of the 5 consultations on CSS has the government stakeholders from South Asia and Central and West Asia. Combined, these 2 regions have 16 member countries that form 32% of ADB's 49 regional member countries. In its 2021 annual report, these regions had about half of ADB's total lending commitments in 2020 across many sectors of development financing, whether it's from infrastructure to public sector management, education, health, agriculture, and natural resources. With the use of the different lending instruments and or financing modalities. As the primary target audiences of this session, we'd like to hear the views and recommendations from the executing agencies and other stakeholders, implementing agencies involved in implementing safeguards in projects. Our registration shows we have 10 countries from these regions represented by 67 participants. I just want to note that India has the largest registration here, about 48 participants. We are also joined by other stakeholders from other regions. Now, as the topic deals mainly with the strengthening of and the approach to using CSS, it's time to hear from you about the challenges and results of applying ADB safeguards requirements as they apply to your countries that also have relevant, if not potentially equivalent or acceptable laws, regulations, and agency mechanisms, which in this conversation we call your own country safeguard systems. Second, we sent you 3 questions last week as part of the consultation materials for your prior reading, which is now being flashed on your screen. We hope to hear from you about these 3 important questions because this will feed into the draft analytical study on CSS that was presented earlier by Zara, and this can also feed into the development and deliberation of the working paper for the new policy. To help us respond to your comments, Director Bruce Dunn and Zara Abbas are here to respond. Also joining us are ADB experts To respond to your questions and feedback, we have Mr. Ricky Barba, the Principal Safeguard Specialist, who leads ADB Safeguards implementation for the South Asia Department, and Ms. Irina Novikova, the Principal Social Development Specialist, who is also in our panel. It's been mentioned earlier, so if you would like to make an intervention, it's easy. You can raise your hand by clicking the emoticon button in your Zoom. You can also write your comments in chat box. I will call you accordingly. And if you feel more comfortable speaking in the language of your choice, Hindi, Urdu, and Russian interpreters are here to assist you. And if you wish to send your questions anonymously, or if you do not want to be identified, you can, as Azim said, directly send them to me, my colleagues Josh and Jennifer. So, all right, let's get the ball rolling. Who would like to start, please? Or, while others are still contemplating on raising your hand now, may I use my power to call on Mr. Sikar Pichika. I apologize if I mispronounce your name, because you sent an advanced question. Mr. Pichika, I see that you are in the room. Would you like to come in, please? All right. Maybe he's having some issue, but I will get back to you later. Or again, Mr. Sishinkapor Pichika, please come in whenever you are ready. For now, I see Mr. Janaki M. I see you have a question in chat box. Would you like to come in, please? Okay, Mr. is taking up some. All right then. So maybe what I can do then is, there's also a question that was posed in our earlier session, which is really worth answering because it's also relevant to our discussion today. This question is from Mr. Steve Say, the Chief Safeguards Officer from the Ministry of Infrastructure Development from Solomon Islands. Let me quickly read this. There is a contradiction of the ADB SPS in the Road Act of our country, Solomon Islands, especially when it comes to compensating affected persons along the public roads right of way when implementing projects funded by the ADB. The SPS states that we need to compensate affected people while our road acts criminalize those who are obstructing or impeding the road's right of way. We spent a lot of money compensating people who are disrupting our roads, informal market stalls on roadsides, just to fulfill the ADB safeguards policy requirements. The Road Act of our country did not allow for this, but because of the funding from ADB, we have to pay compensation to such affected people. My question is, how can we ensure the ADB safeguards policy and the CSS are compatible with other? May I ask Ms. Irina Novikova, please, because this falls directly under her expertise or focus on land acquisition and involuntary resettlement. Ms. Irina, would you like to come in, please?
Yes, thank you, Johnson. Hello, everyone, and thanks a lot for posing this question now. I just wanted to mention it's a direct response. We find that it's a very common issue, and most, if not all, ADB DMCs have this divergence in requirements vis-a-vis SPS. And in many contexts, people are penalized for encroaching on the right-of-way, and they may not be entitled for compensation of affected assets. In the revision of our standard on land acquisition, we are sure that ADB will continue to provide protections to persons without recognizable rights to land, and with a particular focus on vulnerable affected persons. at the project level, it's still important. While this is the case, it's still important to ensure that the risks of speculative encroachments are well managed. So this involves timely communications with affected persons, and it also is quite important to record all impacts at the time of due diligence. And as we discussed during the land acquisition stakeholder engagement consultations, ADB may also consider cost sharing from loan proceeds on case-by-case basis. And then these details will need to be reflected in the land acquisition plans. So thanks. Back to you, Justin.
Thank you, Irina. Let me then call on Mr. Sashish Shakar Pichika. I hope that you are reconnected. Mr. Pichika, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I'm able to hear you. Sorry, actually, I'm unable to find what is the query I had asked. I'm really sorry about that. That's why I didn't respond.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Would you like me to read the questions yet again?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yes. So these are you don't need to answer all of them, but here are the three questions. First, what are the advantages and disadvantages of ADB safeguards policy approach to the use of country safeguard system, and what are your recommendations for the new policy? Second, how could ADB better work with its clients and affected communities and even CSOs to strengthen CSS and the capacity to use it? And number three, are there good practices outside of multilateral financing institutions, maybe India, that ADB should be looking at with respect to country safeguard systems? Mr. Pichika, I see that you are safeguard specialist for the Karnataka Urban Infrastructure Development Project. So I think you are one of the right people to ask of these questions. Do you have any comments, please?
Yeah, regarding the advantages and disadvantages, see, SPSS is a good document which we can follow. But see, that is a requirement of ADB. But what we are having a problem is, I mean, I can maybe speak for people in my state. There is no actual framework for our environment documentation requirements. But I like the SPSS approach. Why? Because it actually highlights a lot of things that are there. Of course, they're there in our existing policy and everything. But the problem is, see, we are unable to, show that this is also a way of meeting the requirements to the public or the project that we are working on. And some of the disadvantages, other disadvantage of SPSS is, I think still the most of the multilateral agencies, there is a requirement of payment that needs to be made for even the people who have unauthorizedly occupied government property. Of course, we agree with that, and usually contractor takes care of that. But we are having a problem, to convince the government in that particular aspect. So these are the two main things under the SPSS. But the overall SPSS documentation is actually very good. I think you have to elaborate more on the climate change, because there's only just maybe one word or two words on the climate part, so that it is more in line with whatever policies that we have in India. And The second one, how could ADB better work with its client and affected communities and CSOs to strengthen CSS and the capacity to use it? I think ADB has a very good mechanism. I don't have much of comments here. I think they're doing a good job because the environmental and social, they're very much engaged with our PMU and also PIU if required. And we make sure the documents are done on time and it is even put on the website of KWC and also on the project city where we work. Of course, we're doing a lot of documentation, but here also there's a disadvantage where the consultants and even the ULB, they do not have much focus on this. But of course, because of the ADB system, because you make these documents, get it produced systematically and available, they use the information, but they do not, I feel they do not appreciate it overall. So I think maybe this focus of the whole thing maybe slightly needs to change. Then the good practices outside multiple finance agencies that ADB should be looking with respect to the country safeguard system. I think you have already incorporated many of the good practices. The other good practices that the state government uses, maybe checklists. We use a form of checklist for submitting the environmental and social. I know you have the checklist that is there in the beginning of the assessment of the environmental and social safeguards. But I think these checklists also needs to look at the entire, what is that? The life cycle of the entire projects. And we need to bring more checklists. It's happening, but I feel these checklists, if they are there in the beginning itself, they will help the implementing agents to better execute the people on much hassles, because other people feel it as somewhat as a hassle, or why we are doing this, why we're doing this social environmental, so much documentation, where we don't do it at the state or the district level. So these are the only issues. But overall, I feel SPS's approach is very good, and the documentation, it is required. Of course, people use it, like I told you, but they don't really appreciate it. Maybe we have to focus on this particular portion where the people appreciate it, and make sure there's a small checklist in the beginning, so that they see that information in a very concise form instead of a very elaborate form. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pichika. There was some point when you became a bit choppy, but if I were to pick some of the 3 key points I got from your responses, you mentioned about how the ADB's current SPS, as it applies, is a very good reference. However, you mentioned some difficulty when it comes to documentation compliance, as well as getting the contractors compliance with the requirements. And however, with respect to your response to number 3, other good practices, you mentioned that there's some good environmental and social assessment checklist practices, which is now being used in the state level. Maybe you're referring to Karnataka, but you mentioned that there is still an effort that needs to be made that this actually gets followed at the district level. I hope that I get some of your key points, Mr. Pichika. So, yeah, for now, may I ask, well, Bruce and Ricky, can I get you to first respond to some of these responses, please? Bruce, maybe you can start, and then Ricky.
Thank you, Jelson. And thank you very much, Mr. Pichika. Really appreciated your thoughts. I'll cover a couple of key points and then pass to Ricky Barbo, who works in a focused way for our South Asia region and would be able to pick up some more details. Firstly, I appreciate very much hearing that the existing safeguard policy document and the overall structure and requirements is useful, but understanding, of course, that we can enhance the way that it's used. Two key points here is, one, I think we need to do more work systematically on continuously assessing the country systems and the way that they apply in the context of our projects. And you mentioned in your early comment that it can be challenging sometimes to be able to show the way that you can actually meet the safeguard policy requirements. Now, we have done some benchmarking studies around equivalence and acceptability for India, or equivalence at least. But I think on a regular basis, we need to be able to update those studies so that when we come down to a project level, we can more easily come to a common understanding around what are the consistencies and what are the differences. So I think that is a key area that we would like to strengthen and link that into our country partnership strategy process. Then secondly, you made a very good recommendation around guidance and checklists, and that's very much an area that we understand we should strengthen. In fact, the independent evaluation department, when they assessed our existing policy, they identified that ADB's guidance in comparison to, say, other multilateral organizations is less. We've tended to stay with the policy and not really develop much in terms of implementation guidance. So that's something that we would like to strengthen more. Checklists are always very useful. And actually, we've heard this from other clients as well, including our developing member countries, but also with the private sector. They would also appreciate very much those checklists to help them work through the processes. So, I mean, that's very, very clear and very helpful recommendations to have. So I'll stop with those 2 points, but I'll pass to Ricky if he has some further observations. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Ricky?
Thank you very much, Bruce and Mr. Pichika. First of all, maybe I can give some context that KUIDFC, from where Mr. Pichika is from, has been one of our very good partners. In fact, if we were to continue embarking on an agency level, I think KUIDFC is a good candidate of long work headed by the South Asia Urban and Water Division. Ninette has moved on, Swati is still there, but they have invested a lot in capacity building. And so I think it comes out from the words of Mr. Pichika. I just want to pick up on some things. I think perhaps not really CSS, but KUIDFC is an agency that we can further have discussions with, because he also picked out that climate change is not very much stressed in SPS. That's been one of their questions. One of the things that's important also to note from KUIDFC is they work with the World Bank. Often there's coexisting projects of the World Bank and ADB. So they have seen the different systems and the advantages and disadvantages of one over the other. So yes, again, KUIDFC is one of the agencies where you can see acceptability. And equivalence would have to be more of a nationwide coverage, because they are also governed by, the central policies and legislation. So it's one area that we might want to go to in the future if it's picked up by a country programming strategy, country partnership strategy rather. Thank you.
Thanks, Ricky, for that context. So, Mr. Pichika, would you have any follow-up to your questions or responses from Bruce or Ricky?
Yeah, actually, I think Bruce was mentioning that compared to other multilateral agencies, I think the ADB is little on the downside. I don't agree with that. I think ADB is always on the higher side. It's good also. The documentation, the support that we get is quite good. And I think it's a multi-level approach you have. I think one from the main agency, and also you bring in consultants who also support that. So I think that mechanism is quite good because it helps to little upgrade the consultants also and the local level, because they get a chance to work with them and also understand what are the issues at the local level. So, and how to intervene at that level also, I think, I don't know whether you know about it, but it takes care of that aspect also. So it helps the consultant to directly engage and also to improve himself. And even our own people also are actually trying to do that. But unfortunately, maybe they're unable to engage and improve themselves, some of them. But overall, it is a good mechanism you have in place. So I think that is one of the most, one of the best practices you have in ADB.
That's a very reinforcing statement, Mr. Pichika. I'm not sure, Bruce, if you would like to respond.
Well, to say thank you. No, I appreciate that very much, the support. Because, you know, also we need to understand what's working. And, you know, if things are supportive already, then that's a good base for us to build on. So thank you. Very much appreciate that support.
Very well then, thank you. So, Mr. Pichika, please do come in later if you have some follow-up comments to make. For now, let's move to another question. This time, this is coming from Lalrimruata Chakchuwak. I hope that I pronounce it correctly. Mr. Chakchuwak, I apologize again. Are you in the call? Please do come in if you are. Okay, so if you are not, or if you are do not want to come, I can then simply read your questions. They're quite succinct. Number one, for implementation of CSS at the country, sector, and agency level, who will decide? Second, it's important that the accountability mechanism is still with the ADB. Third, for a country like India, who doesn't legally recognize indigenous people, if CSS is implemented, how will this apply to indigenous people's planning frameworks and indigenous peoples being involved in the planning? I think these are very, very important questions. So why don't I turn to you again, Ricky, especially with question number 3. And 1 and 2, may I ask Zara Abbas to address these first 2 questions, please. All right, Ricky, I think you are muted. You should unmute.
Okay, I got it, Jelson. I'm sorry how these things sometimes cause difficulties. I'm just trying to navigate them. As Zara is not here, I think the first question was on Jelson. Sorry, could you give me a recap on the questions?
Sure.
The second was accountability mechanism. Sorry, I lost something.
Sure. The first question is, for implementing CSS at the country, sector, and agency level, who will decide?
Okay.
And the third question is, for a country like India, who doesn't legally recognize indigenous people, if CSS is implemented, how can indigenous people's planning framework be incorporated in that? How can IPs be involved in the planning and implementation?
All right, thank you. Those are very important questions on the decision whether it is country, sector, agency, or project level. So the technical terms are national, subnational, and agency level. The decision is something that is from government, in my experience. So India had requested for a national level CSS assessment, and they had also requested on an agency level for power grid. In Sri Lanka, the request was directly on an agency level, and that's the reason why we went on an assessment for the Roads Development Authority. I think the second question again, Jelson, sorry, but if I missed something, but it was on accountability mechanism and CSS. Well, accountability mechanism, in my understanding, applies in CSS as well. So what they will be looking at is compliance with a policy, basically, and how the CSS has been implemented with regard to the country system. So that's number 2. And number 3, there are regulations, laws, which we studied with regard to indigenous people. In India, they are around, legislation and guidelines and requirements on scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And we have, in our assessment, found positive things, which have a lot of equivalence with ADB's SPS, but also we also saw gaps. These are still under discussion with government for them to comment on, and we can take the discussion forward. But yes, there will be gaps which need to be addressed through an action plan as is required in undertaking CSS under the current SPS. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky. Bruce, would you like to come in? I know that you have some addition on the question of who decides on CSS.
Yes, thank you, Jelson, and thank you to the participant that shared those very good questions. Yeah, so I just wanted to cover, Ricky spoke about a government request coming to ADB to consider the use of country safeguard systems, and that's the trigger for the process. But perhaps, and I wasn't sure with the question, whether they were also asking about who then decides on whether it's equivalent or not. Where does that decision come? So I just wanted to speak to that in case that was part of the question. So there the answer is ADB undertakes the assessment work. We would do that in consultation with the client, so say working very closely with a government agency, but we'll also undertake our own independent assessments. Once the assessment of the equivalence and acceptability is completed, we would then also open that up for further public consultation, so with civil society and non-government organisations and other stakeholders, in addition to government, and then take further views. But then finally, ADB would be the one to decide if we considered it to be equivalent and acceptable in comparison to our own policy. So, so that's ultimately our decision. Once management has made that decision, we would then take it forward to our board. And actually, it's our board that then has to endorse and approve that. And our board is actually made up of representatives from our developing member countries, as well as other developed and non-regional members. So, there's a number of processes of assessment and then consultation and review before we can finally come to a conclusion about that process. So it's fairly lengthy and we think fairly robust, but of course it takes a lot of time, and I think that's also one of the issues why we haven't moved forward with more than a few of these. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Before I call Mr. Janaki, who I believe is using two gadgets, let me just make a call to those participants in the room who are contemplating on giving questions or comments. I note that we have 4 registered participants from Bangladesh, Armenia, particularly from the project implementing units, executing agencies as well. India has 48, so we would like to really hear from you, because I know many of you are quite involved in many of these projects supported by the ADB. We also have participants from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, also from Pakistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. So we'd like to hear from you. We would like to maximize the time. So, all right. Do we have Mr. Janaki in the room to So Mr. Janaki, if you're in the room, please do come in. All right, so while waiting for him, I can simply read this question. Before taking up any project, comprehensive training shall be given to all the stakeholders in respect of SPS by the ADB, and discussion in the CSS may also be taken up even prior to submission of PPR of the project, so that there shall be no hindrance during project implementation. I believe this question or comment goes straight to Zara. Zara, are you back?
Yes, it was very choppy. Could you just repeat the question? There's something wrong with my internet. There's one is that, can you just repeat the question?
Sure. In fact, I think this question goes to the point of capacity building and strategic engagement early. So let me repeat this. Before taking up any project, comprehensive training shall be given to all the stakeholders with respect to the use of SPS by the ADB, and discussion on CSS may also be taken up even prior to submission of PPR. Not sure what the PPR is, probably you know, of the project, so that there shall be no hindrance during project implementation.
Okay, yes. Well, when the projects are approved and the field work starts, this is it is best practice to undertake training, to impart training at the level of the field where the contractors are, and this training is mostly given either to the contractors by the supervision consultant, but before that, there are also trainings that are given to the implementing agency staff. These are built into the project design. It could be that sometimes they don't happen, but this is part of, this is done to ensure that implementation at the field level is done, it happens properly. So that's the part that I could hear, but unfortunately, Justin, it was very choppy. I couldn't get the second part of the question. I mean, if somebody else got it, they can pick it up, or you can repeat the question. I think there's something wrong with my internet today.
Yeah, I think many of us do. But basically, the second question is that any application of the CSS should be taken up prior to submission of PPR, so that there shall be no hindrance during project implementation. I see Zara is frozen again. Bruce, would you like to come in here?
Sure, yeah, as Zara's internet's having trouble. I apologize for that also to everyone. Sometimes in these consultations, the connections is a bit of a hindrance. So yeah, I mean, two very good parts to that discussion. On the first part, the need for early stage training, I think Zara has largely addressed this, but yeah, it's certainly something that we recognize, and it is usually part of the early stage discussions we have, particularly when we're working with new agencies or new clients. We'd usually do some level of training. However, we need to make this much more systematic, and we need to have the right sort of toolkit available to support that process. Things like short videos, quick e-learning modules, then also standard training materials that we can customize to the project level. So there's some of the things that we're thinking about developing for the new policy. And actually, we expect to have a comprehensive rollout program to support the new policy implementation and then training, country level training, project level training, you know, through that process. Then on the second part of the question, you know, discussions on CSS, I think essentially starting early. And again, we do very much agree with this point. What we're thinking about now, and it'd be great to have your further thoughts, you know, stakeholders, colleagues in this consultation. One, we believe it'd be useful to do benchmarking studies for all the countries that we work in and to have those regularly updated. I know that takes some time. We'll need to work with government stakeholders and agencies in that process. But if we could link this to our country partnership strategy and on a regular basis sort of update those studies, then it becomes sort of a common and agreed benchmark. Now that might still be, reasonably high level, gives us a bird's eye view of sort of the, the overall consistency, but that will give us a very good starting point. Then, of course, in the context of projects, we have that. It's a point that we can then use that for initial discussions, then say in this particular project, what would be some of the issues and what are likely to be some of the consistencies or differences between the country's framework and our own. That would take us a step forward. In some ways, we do some of this already, but again, it's not particularly systematic. So we need to embed this process. Ricky, I'm looking at you there also, nodding. I'm wondering, if you have any further thoughts on how we might be able to take some of that forward, say in the South Asia context, it might be useful as well. Thanks.
Yes, Bruce. And I'm thinking about Mr. Janaki's question. And again, apologies also, I'm also having internet things. So just let me know if I become choppy again. But I think the point raised is very important. I would hazard to guess Mr. Janaki is a project person and is actually doing things on the ground. The thing, Bruce, that we have experienced also is sometimes the disparity between the kind of training available for the different components of ADB projects, right? So just like the KUIDFC issue, which, or rather question, I think it points out to their capacity has been built quite well because of successive projects, but particularly for new projects, there's need for comprehensive training. And Mr. Janaki's question, if I'm reading from the chat box, is to all stakeholders. I think we should not just be training the EA and the IA, but really all stakeholders to understand how the application is. And as you said, I totally agree. And I think this is the essence of a few slides of Zara's presentation, that this can be moved even upfront when you're talking about CSS via the CPS, via the country partnership strategy. So that, yes, if that's discussed, then we all are in the same page, and that there's complete understanding by all stakeholders, and there will also be smoother project implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky. We don't have questions, so again, or hands raised, but I think it's a good time to mention some agencies that are represented here, because we really would like to hear from you. I see that we have the project director from Bangladesh Local Government Engineering Department. We also have safeguard specialist and general manager for RUIDP. Also from the Assam Urban Infrastructure Investment Program. I think this is really the time to hear from you, those who are in the thick of the project implementation, because there's a lot of ground level lessons from there with respect to the use of ADB safeguards and also making reference to the CSS. Also, we have people from the Department of Works and Highways of Papua New Guinea. Also from Armenia. And again, so many colleagues from government representatives from India and also from Kazakhstan. So may we hear from you, please?
Can I come in again?
Yes, please. Mr. Pichika?
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, with the help of ADB, we had made one EHS manual, which I wasn't able to take it any further. Here, this manual basically covers health and safety much more than what your SPSS covers. Maybe we can see this document and see how we can cover the health and safety aspects also in a better way. Because somehow we tend to forget the health and safety part. We only see the environment and the social. So maybe it needs to be covered better there, because every single work that we are covering has an IS code or an ISO code which elaborates a lot of health and safety things which need to be done. But unfortunately, it is so enormous that we might not be able to put it into one SPSS document or something. Maybe we can provide some opportunity to open up this aspect which we usually neglect, and we don't document basically. But we do it, but maybe we're not doing it and showcasing it and telling, yes, we are following all these things. Maybe that is also one area which needs to be worked on. Just want to tell you that. So we made one almost nearly 300, 500 pages document with help of ADB only, recently, maybe 2 years back. It was a very good initiative, and immediately, actually, I wanted to initiate, and ADB immediately responded, and we did it. But before we could take it any further, the MD changed, the administration changed. So this is when administration changes, the whole thinking changes. So again, we're just trying to push it back up maybe this year, just seeing how it can be done. Because once it is institutionalized in the government, then no matter who comes, whether you are there or whether I'm there, we start moving ahead at least. So with that idea, we did it with the ADB's help. But let's see, this year we might be able to do it. So maybe you can also take a look at that. Maybe there is something there that can be added into your SPSS document. So it might be a good idea to look at that.
Thanks, Mr. Pichika. Bruce or Ricky, would you like to speak to his points on improving the health and safety part?
Not really to comment or anything, but I just want to thank the gentleman from KUIDFC for sharing that. I think that's one of the things that's being picked up also by STSS on updating the SPS, that health and safety is an occupational health and safety is an issue. And if I may explain, Bruce, this is, I think, the work that Ninette left before she moved, but it's been an extensive amount of work on occupational health and safety. But I also picked up on what he was saying about institutionalization, and that's, I think, why we work on CSS, right, to see where the system has gaps, where systems can be improved, where good practices are already there in the country safeguard system that just has to be continued. So yes, I think this is even more rationale for moving CSS ahead in the next iteration of SPS, because there are really good lessons that where capacity can be built and transferred in amongst the agencies and even across countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Ricky. Bruce?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to add to that just briefly. Firstly, thank you for raising the issue of health and safety, because it's one of the areas that actually we would like to strengthen. And it's one of those areas that you really can see the impact to people's lives if you can get it right or if you can get it wrong. Fatalities on site, for example, with workers. I mean, it's something that breaks your heart to see when it could have been easily avoided, and understanding how you can improve project designs or how you can build expertise on site to identify issues and manage them appropriately. It really does make a big difference. So I think this is an area we want to strengthen. Actually, we are working at the moment to try and go through a process of strengthening our own staff skills and working towards having accreditation of professionals as health and safety experts within the organisation, and then extend that to capacity building programs. So I'd be very interested in the work that you've done so far and how we can learn from that and build on it. Then on the point of institutionalization, absolutely agree. Ricky touched on this as well. And I think one point I'd like to just pick up from the consultation that we did on the same topic earlier this morning to bring over here. A colleague from Cambodia actually talked about their standard operating procedures, which they have documented. And I think that's a really good way of distilling some of the key issues, because you take your government laws and regulations and the standard procedures that you apply in projects. If you can document that very carefully, or with support working with a partner to document that, that really gives you that operational understanding of how you're going to do things in practice. And then, of course, it gives you a good starting point to look at where you can strengthen those processes. So that can be one area that we can look at as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I don't see any hands raised or any questions in chat, but we have about 5 to 7 minutes left. So I might use this time to call Zara back, maybe just to reiterate what the direction is now on CSS as ADB is moving forward with the safeguards policy review and update process. You have mentioned, she has mentioned this in her presentation earlier, but perhaps this is a good time to re-emphasize what the direction is for the ADB. Sarah, are you back?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, good. Yes. I think I've figured out my internet problem as well. Sorry about that. Really sorry about that. So yes, well, first, what we really saw were there were some difficulties in the use of country safeguard systems. And from there, we learned that there are some future directions that are possible. And the biggest problem was establishing equivalence based on the current policy that we have. So what we, that's what we feel, and which is, I think, coming across through the points that I was able to capture, was that yes, early engagement is very important, and early strategic engagement with our government partners to identify at the planning stage when they are planning their portfolios with ADB on what would be the what are the priority sectors, and in those sectors what are the how then with respect to that sectors, if we can start looking at the system at an early stage and identify areas where we can build capacity or where there is a room for making any sorts of changes in the policy, and then trying to implement those through possibly through our different modalities that ADB has. So an approach we're strengthening through modalities of such as the results-based lending or policy-based lending, which gives us the opportunity to strengthen the system as well as strengthen the capacity of the institution as well as strengthen the systems of that institution. So that's the general direction we were discussing here. And so where if legal reforms are needed, then that conversation can also start if we have a early policy engagement at the level of the country programming. So and then some of the, based on the experience of other MFIs, there could be project level use of CSS. There could be standard level use of CSS, that where the standard, where the legal framework can be used in a certain area only. And so these are some of the areas that we are looking at, but the discussion is still open, and we're going to see what everybody thinks about these and then have more discussion around it.
All right. Thank you, Zara. So before we close this session, we will hear the question coming from Central and West Asia in Russian. We managed to translate it, but if you are in the room, Mr. Obaid Akramov, please do come in. I see that you have attended many of our previous consultations, so it would be good to hear from you. Otherwise, let me use the translation from Irina what are the key factors that drive the implementing measures on biodiversity preservation and balance? Then, yeah, so also another way to say it is that what are the main factors influencing the implementation of projects for the conservation of biodiversity and ecological balance? I think this question will go to Bruce.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Akramov, I believe it was. Thank you so much for the question. So under the current policy framework, we, of course, seek to avoid, minimize, or offset any impacts on the environment. That also includes nature. But then there are some specific requirements depending on the type of habitats and also the species that we're dealing with. So if you've got areas that are important for the protection or conservation of endangered or critically endangered species, or also some important sites, for example, World Heritage areas or important national protected areas, then we would consider these to be critical habitats. And then the policy requires that we really should avoid any significant impacts on those sites, except under certain circumstances when we would be able to show that there wouldn't be an impact on the critical habitat values. Basically, we should avoid those areas. If there are natural habitats though, so still important, but not as sensitive, then we really should avoid any significant conversion or degradation of those habitats. Another area that is considered is then modified habitats. So these would be areas where their natural values has been substantially changed over time. So we apply this hierarchy depending on the importance of the habitats for then determining the type of measures that should be incorporated into the project design, maybe avoiding or also mitigating and minimizing. But often there are, though, allowances for the offsets of impacts. And so this is something that the policy framework allows. But in practice, we see that offsets are actually quite challenging. So we're reviewing the arrangements for these in the context of the policy at the moment. So I hope that's just given a little bit of information, but the question was fairly broad. So if you have more specifics, please do feel free to come in and share some further details. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I see no hands raised anymore, no questions in chat, but I think this is also the right time to start wrapping up this session. But just two notes I'd like to mention. One, I know that this is an important topic for many of the DMC members of the Asian Development Bank. This is part of the management discussion with the board. This is also going to be one of the topics that will be discussed when ADB does its in-country deep dive consultation. Second, I really would like to thank the substantive engagement feedback from many of the implementing agencies from South Asia, particularly India. It does show the level of depth about your understanding of how the CSS applies and how the ADB safeguard policies work on the ground, while at the same time noting some areas for improvement. So on that note, I want to thank everybody for your participation. But please don't go yet, because we will have a poll that will be facilitated by Azim. So Azim, back to you.
Thanks, Jelson, for framing and contextualizing our way forward on the discussions and for moderating the Q&A session. Let me also thank Bruce Dunn, Zara Abbas, Irina Novikova, yourself, Jelson, as well as Ricky Barba and Patty Moore, as well as others who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes. But of course, the biggest and most special thanks are to you, the participants and informants, for raising your insightful comments, the clarity of your questions, the sharing of your experiences, and the constructive feedback. We hope that it certainly doesn't end here. I want to reiterate that the comments on the country safeguard systems that we've received so far from this consultation and the comments we hope to continue to receive will be considered in the final study report. In turn, that final study report will inform the revision of ADB's standard and updating of the safeguards policy statement. As Jelson said, please don't go. We have two quick polls. The first is a Zoom poll, which is going to be flashed on the screen now. Please rate your satisfaction with today's session. You can only choose one from 1 to 5. So 5 is the highest you can score and 1 is the lowest. Please give us your frank and candid opinion of how satisfied you were or are with today's interaction, discussions, deliberations. And we would like to wrap that poll up in the next 40 or so seconds. So if you could just tap in a number between 1 and 5, would be very grateful. And of course, you have much more time to think about the Menti poll, which I raised earlier. That is again being flashed in the chat box now. So please copy that link and go to the link and fill in your 3 or 4 or 5 sentences as to how in the longer term, the ADB can continue to improve these engagements with you, our stakeholders, and develop more reciprocity, more informed opinion, and more input from you onto how the safeguards policy statement can or will be revised and reviewed. But for now, please rate this particular consultation on the level of satisfaction that you have felt on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. And as soon as we wrap that up, let's say in the next 10 or 15 seconds, we will of course go to Bruce Dunn, who will provide us with a summary of today, as well as walk us through the next steps of what we could look forward to in the remaining 7 or 8 consultations. So if we have the results of today's consultation, there it is. We can see that we've got almost 97% have ranked a 4 or better for today. 3% have scored this consultation as neutral. And for all of those who assessed and ranked today's consultation, we would like to hear from you on the menti.com poll. What specific improvements can be made? We view this as very much a learning exercise and a work in progress. So the ADB want to know specifically what improvements can be made, and you can provide those types of inputs on the menti.com poll. So for now, let me thank everyone and hand you back over to Director Bruce Dunn to provide us a summary and insights onto the next steps. Bruce?
Good, thank you very much, Azim, and thank you once again for everyone joining today from across South Asia and Central and West Asia, or wherever you're joining us today. We covered a number of important topics, and I do thank everyone who's shared their comments today. Let me provide just a very brief summary of some of the key issues. Firstly, and very kindly, some of you have mentioned that the safeguard policy statement does provide a useful reference and clarity in terms of the ADB policy requirements, and that it can actually be easy to use. Of course, though, there are some issues between the compatibility of the policy with country safeguard systems, and there are some areas to strengthen. Differences between the country systems and ADB requirements, of course, can create challenges and costs. You know, we're hearing from you and others about that, and opportunities to streamline and simplify processes, I think, are going to be very important. There are some critical issues, for example, mentioned today around land acquisition and informal settlers. You know, this is a typical issue where ADB and other multilateral financial institutions' requirements might be different. Perhaps sometimes we come at this from a different angle. For example, as a development project, we do want to make sure that no one is worse off, including, in this case, people that might be considered illegal or land encroachers. And we want to make sure that by them, you know, losing businesses or structures, they're not worse off. But of course, we, you know, need to look and see, you know, how those measures can be implemented practically at the local levels. And of course, there are other differences. So having a better understanding of the country systems against ADB requirements on a consistent level is very important. And I think we've clearly heard the, the need to be able to assess those carefully. There are also some questions about how do we initiate more detailed processes to assess country systems with the view to potentially using those. We've mentioned that this is usually kicked off through a formal government request, which then leads ADB to doing equivalence and acceptability assessments. These are studies that ADB commissions and leads, but works very closely with the government on. And then we also do stakeholder consultations around prior to ADB board and management consideration. Moving forward, we are looking to try and strengthen that process through stronger linkages around country safeguard systems at our country partnership strategy level, what we call our CPS level. So making sure that we undertake these studies on a regular basis and then have dialogue at the country level with key agencies and then link that down to the project level. So that's an important area that we're looking to strengthen. Also, we've heard from you around the need for strengthening capacity. The capacity support that we provide is useful, and thank you again for those of you that have confirmed that, but it does need to be sustained. Long-term engagement is really important for working with our developing member country clients, but also for other stakeholders. We need training at country levels, but also from a very early stage at the project level, discussions before we go into the details of project preparation. And things like additional guidance and checklists will be extremely useful in those areas. And then lastly, to mention, we are thinking about some further opportunities for both strengthening and using country systems. One, just in terms of strengthening, we do plan to have a capacity development rollout program for the new policy. Secondly, we would like to see if there are opportunities to work with our developing member countries around appropriate policy reforms. If there are areas that you would like to work on, then we can use, say, our policy-based lending or other instruments to work with you around those systems. We also think that our results-based lending modality could be an appropriate avenue to explore, as that does allow you to look at program systems and how they can be applied and then strengthened as necessary. And then lastly, we're considering the language of the policy. At the moment, we have this fairly strict focus on equivalence, which is often interpreted in a very narrow legal sense. But we feel moving forward, we really need to focus in on outcomes. So reviewing the legal frameworks and the capacity with a view as to what would be the outcome, and is the outcome likely to be consistent with the ADB policy framework. And you're best able to understand those outcomes when you look at applying it down at a project level, where you can understand the specific issues around project design, impacts, and risk management. So a bit more focus on the project level rather than trying to really take on accreditation at, say, the country level or the agency level. So these are some of the things that we're thinking about at the moment, and we've got some feedback from you today. But of course, we'll be developing this next into the draft policy itself, and then we will be circulating that for further stakeholder engagement to get your comments and recommendations. So we look forward to further engagement with you. Until then, we hope that some of you may be joining future consultations. We do have other topics that we will be covering in this series through April, May, and then into June. We'll be doing additional sessions on gender and safeguards, also climate change, and we'll be looking at the application of our policy to different financing modalities, including private sector work. So quite a number of topics still to go in this series. Thank you again for joining, and until next time, please stay safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.